Tom Talk Teaching, a podcast about all things education presented by Tom Breeze. Learning Styles, the neuromyth that just won't die, with Dr Louise Allen-Walker. Hello and a warm welcome back to Emma and Tom Talk Teaching, where I'm all on my lonesome here in the studio, so very glad to have on the screen a veteran of the podcast, Dr Louise Allen-Walker, who's joining us from Bridgend. Welcome.
Hi, nice to be back.
You've made that sound very convincing. So Louise, you are on the criminology programme and the MSc Psychology and Education, so you are a psychologist of sorts then.
Yeah, I teach a lot of psychology and how it can be applied and used by practitioners in a bunch of different settings. Yeah, that's me.
Lovely. And to our small and very dedicated band of YouTube subscribers, if you're a dog fan, now is the time to watch this video because we have another podcast dog. Hello.
Sorry, Alf. I woke him up for that.
You woke him up for that starring moment. Yeah. Okay, so we're on our final episode of season 9, and we thought we would go out with a bit of a bang this time by taking on one of the big beasts of psychology and education, or certainly in education. Now, in the past, you've come on and busted neuromyths, haven't you? And there is no neuromyth bigger than learning styles.
No, it's prolific. It won't go away.
So if you've not come across learning styles, then you're a lucky person. We will explain in a moment what that is about. But for the benefit of anyone who has not heard some of your previous outings on the podcast, Louise, what do we mean when we talk about a neuromyth?
So a neuromyth is a kind of commonly held idea about how the brain works that sounds as though it might be based in neuro research, but is in fact not. But a lot of these have become really entrenched in our idioms and way of speaking about the brain. They are in our media. They're everywhere. The kind of common one that I talk about a lot is that we only use 10% of our brain. Made extra famous by the film Lucy, because of course, if Morgan Freeman says it, it sounds like the most legitimate claim ever. It is in fact not true. We use a whole bunch of brain areas all of the time. It's a massive network doing lots of different things at once, but still part of our kind of everyday discussion about brain function. There are lots.
Morgan. Disappointments.
I know.
So some of these neuromyths, as you say, they're kind of weird little, what used to be called old wives' tales, but we probably shouldn't call them that anymore, just about sort of life in general. But some of them are specific to learning, and that's where we kind of come in on this podcast, because obviously if people are saying stuff about learning that sounds incredibly seductive but isn't actually true, that's going to have an impact on us as teachers. So learning styles is one of those. It's a neuromyth. It's a thing that people say is true, a kind of seductive story about how the brain works that is linked to the idea about how we should teach pupils. That is a load of old rubbish, basically.
Yes.
Fair way of putting it.
Absolutely.
So I suppose since you always do this so well with your psychological gravitas, you can explain to us what the learning styles neuromyth is trying to have us believe. Let rip.
Okay. So, so the common ones that we will have heard of are like VARK and VAK, so like visual, auditory, kinaesthetic, that we have these specific styles, preferences of learning information, so the modality in which we would like to learn information, and the idea, sometimes called like the meshing hypothesis, is that essentially if we pitch information in the preferred modality to the learner, so say I'm a visual learner in this argument, if I am given instruction in a visual modality, that learning will be more effective than if I'm presented with that same information in, for example, an auditory modality. This, in fact, is not correct, but that is that is what is pitched, and it does sound kind of seductive. I think it it appeals to educators because as someone who teaches, we want to give the learners a tailored experience. We want to help our learners to excel, and we want to treat, although we have to often teach classrooms of, in HE sometimes hundreds of students at once, sometimes tens of students at once, and in school often tens of students at once. It's appealing to want to treat vast quantities of learners as individuals, even when we're in a kind of group setting. But the reality is that not only is this myth not helpful, it also can have a detrimental impact on learners. So one of the main reasons that we find it so frustrating as people who know about this myth being a myth is that it's not just not useful, and using resources in a way that is not as effectively as we would like, particularly when education is so underfunded generally. It is having a detrimental impact on some of our learners, and I think that's why we've picked this one to debunk.
Yeah, and you're right. This is a particularly interesting one in a way, isn't it? Because there's been lots of theories and ideas about the way that people learn, and they come and they go and they get debunked. And, we could probably think of things that people have believed about learning and the brain and the mind and all that sort of stuff that have been thoroughly debunked. The thing that's really interesting about learning styles is it just won't die. You cannot kill it. It's been debunked for absolutely ages. And yet, like one of those invasive weeds, it just will suddenly pop up. And I'm really taken by that thing you said there, which is that as good teachers, we're all taught quite rightly that we can't sort of teach all our pupils as a sort of blob who are all the same, and that we do need to differentiate. We do need to kind of think about how we help pupils with the individual kind of differences that they have from other pupils. But this is taking things a bit further, isn't it? This is like badging people as the only way I can learn is if it's visual, auditory, or kinesthetic.
Yes, and that's part of why it's so damaging, is because learners then become so fixed with the idea, they become kind of blinkered. If I can only learn visually, I will disengage from learning that is happening in an auditory modality, in a kinesthetic modality, whatever it is. And this then, what we want is students to feel empowered to learn. We want them to feel like they can be active participants in learning. But in fact, this idea of learning styles, it takes the power out of the students' hands. It's no longer in their power to learn that material because it's not in their preferred learning style. And it also takes the power out of the educator's hands as well. So no longer is education about being the best educator you can be, like designing your own materials in the most effective way possible, because in this way, in according to this idea, there's nothing that you can do that's special for that learner other than just deliver the information in their preferred learning style. It takes the power from I think the educator and the learner to make education a kind of two-way interactive experience for both people.
Yeah, okay. So we'll probably dig a little bit more into the sort of debunking and some of the kind of mad stuff that's gone on with learning styles. But let's just take a moment. Since you are on the criminology programmes here at Cardiff Met, I thought it might be worth asking you the question whether you have managed to use your criminological skills to actually go back and find out if there was somebody responsible for this originally. Where has this come
a guilty party
from? Yeah, is there a guilty party? Is there somebody who your criminologist might be chasing down the road? Is there a way we can trace it back to some sort of origin story?
I wish there was a sort of supervillain origin story here, but it's kind of muddy. So the idea of learning styles has been around for a long time. I think it was kind of born out of the idea that people with different learning needs, dyslexia, for example, ADHD, etc., that those people might have different learning needs. And then there was kind of this evolution of this idea to encompass learners more generally. There's some talk of psychologists talking about learning styles since like the 1920s, but there's very little, when you dig into it on Google Scholar, there's actually very little information around at that time that's kind of pointing to someone, some guilty psychologist pushing this idea at that time. There's some suggestion that maybe it came out of like Jungian ideas of personality, and there was the Myers-Briggs type indicator, the MBTI personality questionnaire, which is much debunked. And if you want me to come back and do another podcast on how much I dislike the MBTI, I'd be very happy to do that. But there's some argument that it came out of this idea of personality, which has then kind of morphed into an idea that we also, in addition to having specific personality types, we also have specific learning types. But there isn't a nice, clear person that we can kind of point to and say it's all your fault. Unfortunately,
you tried to hunt them down, but you didn't manage to find them. I mean, there's a really interesting point you made there, and it goes back to that thing we said a minute ago about the idea that yes, as good teachers, we will tailor things a little bit to our to our individual pupils. There are definitely pupils out there who, for example, might be neurodiverse. They might be on the autistic spectrum. They might be dyslexic, as you say. They might have dyscalculia. There's a difference, isn't there, between this idea that there will be people with additional learning needs which require us to be good teachers and maybe kind of mix things up and do things in slightly unusual ways, and this idea that the entire population of learners either have to learn through visual materials, through the materials being presented to them in some sort of auditory form, or through the kinaesthetic, the hands-on. Yes,
yeah, absolutely. And it's just a kind of massive oversimplification of how learning occurs for all individuals, regardless of our needs. And one of the things that you kind of pointed to there was this kind of idea of arriving to the conclusion that you're a specific type of learner. And many of these kind of measures are done with questionnaires, sometimes to the educator, sometimes to the learner themselves. And what we kind of see, and this is actually kind of holds up when we look at it empirically, is that people have learning preferences. Absolutely. All learners will have a preference. Some people will prefer to read, some people will prefer to listen. That's legitimate. There's lots of evidence for that.
Yeah, I was going to say about that actually, because I was thinking about myself there, that I know for a fact that I am practically face blind. I mean, I can blank people I've worked with for years going down the corridor. I blanked Emma once. I didn't blank Emma once. I said hello to somebody who I thought was Emma once, and I sit in this studio with her on a regular basis. I'm not big on TV. I'm not big on cinema. I'll listen to audio all day long. But actually, as you sort of say that, you think, well, actually, if I'm kind of weak visually, maybe I should be doing more of it, not less of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the idea that we are limiting learners, that they're kind of forced into this pigeonhole and then not allowing them to explore the breadth of different learning experiences. I mean, as far back as like the 1980s, researchers in education have been saying, well, learning styles is all very well and good, but we shouldn't be pigeonholing learners into specific types and limiting their learning experiences and not allowing them to have the full array of inputs. And research indicates fairly rigorously that multimodal learning experiences are far more effective than learning experiences that are unimodal, like just through visual or auditory or whatever. Yeah.
You mentioned questionnaires there a minute ago. I mean, I suppose there might be some people listening thinking, well, what does it matter that it's debunked? Is it such a terrible thing? Because maybe it's a way to get people to think out of their comfort zone for how they deliver stuff, maybe. I mean, the one that people always used to talk about was this whole idea of the kinaesthetic learner, this idea that you've got some kids, and we know there are some kids in the classroom that would much rather not be sitting on a chair all day long, quietly and writing neatly, that they, have a preference for kind of getting out and doing stuff, and that it's not a bad thing as a teacher to just be reminded to get out of your comfort zone. But there has been some pretty wild, crazy stuff gone off on the back of this, hasn't there? Which has not necessarily been quite so benign. What sort of things are you aware of?
Oh my gosh. I mean, I think the thing that I find kind of worrying is that it is still so persistent and that educators are still so pushed. I think even as recently as 2, maybe 3 years ago, it appeared in our Cardiff Met Quality Enhancement Directorate paperwork.
Oh no!
One of my master's students pointed it out to me. Yeah, I can't remember what paperwork it was, but I find it wild that we are pumping resource, staff time, and financial resource into learning styles. One of the kind of big issues with it, talking about questionnaires, is that there are researchers who have reviewed different measures of learning style. So I think there's one example, Caulfield, 2004, who looked at 71 different ways of examining learning styles. Like, there's no one agreed upon manner of looking at this, though I will say, like, VAK and VARC are by far the kind of most popular, particularly in the UK. And so many of the researchers that are focused on learning styles, many of them are often profiting. There are many kind of independent companies who profit from the propagation of learning styles, from schools utilising resources for it. And so the thing that seems most wild to me is that schools are paying for something that they feel is going to benefit their learners, which is in fact detrimental, and that money could be far more well spent on other types of resource that I think the learners would get more benefit from. Just that's probably the most distressing thing for me, that we're still pumping money into this when schools are so underfunded.
Yes, that is quite unethical, isn't it? When you think about it, if you're taking money for that sort of thing. And I suppose the one that springs to my mind, because I work a lot with student teachers who have to do a lot of lesson planning. It takes them a long time to plan a lesson. This idea that you're going to plan a lesson, but you're also going to do it 3 different ways, and you're going to try and teach those 3 different ways at the same time. I mean, that's a recipe for just crashing and burning, I would have thought.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the reasons that it's so ingrained and it won't leave is because historically, obviously not now, but historically teacher education forced all the people who went through our process to do exactly that, to plan 3 or maybe 4 versions of a lesson to kind of support all of these learners. And then if they're not having that myth overtly debunked in their practice, then it just doesn't go away. So we then have new teachers going out into schools being taught by more experienced and supervised by more experienced peers, who are then kind of propagating this. So it's kind of, I think part of the reason it's so entrenched in our practice in the UK is because there's a whole generation of teachers who were told that this was like the best thing to do, and it was so ingrained in all of their coursework. And now perhaps the partly the fault of universities for not doing enough with schools, there is not a clear, easy mechanism to systematically debunk this myth, which, as I said before, has this really nice, clean, appealing way of treating learners. And lots of research shows us that when neuroscientists and other types of researchers have gone into schools to try and debunk this, one day, like an inset day's worth of education, is not enough to change teachers' minds on these myths, because if they see that things are kind of going well or they're happy with it, why would they change? They have enough going on to not have to then overhaul all of the materials that they've been kind of tweaking for years.
Okay, so let's do a public service here. There's, as a university, we have a civic mission.
Yes.
So here's our civic mission bit for the podcast. Let's just take a moment to just crystallize that this is a debunked neuromyth, why it's a debunked neuromyth, and why we should care. I'll kick off by giving a concrete example, and then you can
Nice.
come in with all your amazing subject knowledge and just sort of put the icing on the cake and do a far better job of me. This is a book that we've reviewed on the podcast a few years ago by Daisy Christodoulou, who is a trenchant writer on education and has written this. It's very accessible. It may well be in a lot of schools. That's why I've picked it. Daisy Christodoulou's book, Teachers versus Tech. And on page 51 of Teachers versus Tech, she gives an example of a brilliantly presented piece of information for the auditory learners amongst us. So as an auditory, I don't know if you would consider yourself an auditory learner, Louise, but let's pretend you are for a moment.
Let's pretend.
I'm going to give you information in your preferred learning style now. This is information about the staffing structure of a school and who's working on a project. And I've got 3 questions for you afterwards. So here we go. Here's your information in your preferred learning style. Jenny is head of the humanities faculty. Fatima is head of the history department. Tom, Joe and Sue work for Fatima. Harry is the head of the geography department. Joe, Chaz and Tanya report to Harry. Sue, Joe, Chaz and Harry are working together on the joint Modern Europe project. So Louise, my question's to you. Who is the highest ranking person on the Modern Europe project?
No idea.
Oh, okay.
No, and this is the second time I've heard this today.
Question 2. Which department has the most people on the Modern Europe project?
History?
I'll tell you in a minute. Question 3. Which people are not involved with the Modern Europe project?
Fatima?
Okay. Well, call yourself an auditory learner, honestly. First of all, it's the geography department that have the most people on the project. Fatima, you were right. Fatima is not involved in the modern history department. The highest ranking person on the Modern Europe project, obviously, was Harry, the head of geography. And the reason I can tell you that, Louise, and if anybody's watching on YouTube, is because I have the diagram version, which is on page 52, where the hierarchy of staff is very, very clearly set out. And the people who were involved in the Modern Europe project are coloured in red with a big box around them. So point made. I mean, that's a kind of crazy example, but nobody is going to get that information. You know, we're not going to kinaesthetically ask you to build a lovely clay model of the history and geography departments either, are we?
No.
It just sort of goes to show how you could take this thing to mad extremes. Anything you would like to add with an actual degree in this subject as to, why this is rubbish and why we should care?
I think in terms of why it's rubbish, one of the things that psychologists particularly are quite obsessed with is the idea of replication. So there was a kind of a replication crisis in psychology over a decade ago where psychologists kind of realized that actually we should be putting a lot of emphasis on the replication of findings to be sure that the findings that we're pushing as useful, legitimate, are being replicated by other researchers in other fields, etc. So one of the things that I would say whenever anyone is looking to kind of change teaching practice on the basis of some sort of psychological finding is look to see if there are replications of those findings. Look to see if researchers outside of the initial kind of key proponents of that idea are finding similar findings. And what we see with learning styles is that no one is finding that systematically learning styles is having a good impact. So 2008, Pashler and colleagues, they mapped out a kind of experimental design that would be the most effective at demonstrating that learning styles is a legitimate way of helping people to learn, which involved examining people's learning styles and also then randomly assigning them to different types of learning and looking to see essentially if people are getting good performance in the learning styles that are congruent with what they kind of perceive that their learning styles are. In 2008, in their review paper, after kind of going around talking about this, they concluded that there was really not enough evidence to be using resource for learning styles. So that was in 2008. Using that same kind of statistical research design, in 2015, Rogowski in adults also showed, using this method, this kind of structure of experiment, that learning styles was not helpful. The Rogowski and colleagues in 2020 again show that this is not happening in 10 to 11-year-olds. Further back, using a slightly different research design, Kratzig and Arbuthnot in 2006 also found that learning styles was not kind of congruent with what people were best at in terms of their performance. So in terms of what I would think is the most important factor in making a decision in terms of changing my teaching practice, replication of findings, the replication clearly shows that learning styles and teaching to someone's preferred learning style does not stand up to experimental design. It's not coming out of those papers. Consistently for a really long time.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, there's
for decades.
There's an interesting thing. I mean, I could definitely signpost the listeners back to an episode you did a number of years ago now, where you talked about the replication crisis. It's interesting, isn't it? There's a whole kind of rabbit hole we could go down here, particularly for those of us who are involved in sort of saying, education should be informed by research, which is that there are perverse incentives in some research, particularly in your field, which is to make shiny new stuff and find impacts rather than publish stuff which retreads something that's been before or completely fails to find an impact. And those incentives to academics, which will get them kind of promotion and prestige and pay rises and things like that, are not far off in terms of unethical outcomes. So the stuff we were talking about earlier about people taking your money to do dodgy questionnaires. Yeah,
exactly. And unfortunately, education is one of those areas that is really rife with people trying to do something that sounds kind of sexy and exciting and that it's really going to help, and then the research backing just isn't there. However, 20 years later, when people are still talking about it, there are still lots of people profiting. Brain Gym is another really good example in education. The idea that we've got like buttons here that if we press, our learning is magically somewhere around the clavicle. I'm not exactly sure if it's above or below. Anyway, utter nonsense. The idea that we need to integrate our left and right hemispheres by doing what are essentially like little physical exercises and weird noises moving our heads around that I'm not going to demonstrate because I'm on camera and I find them bizarre. But yeah, again, people profiting because, educators are people who want to do best by their students. There is money available. Not a lot, but there is money available to help learners by doing new things. Education wants to use new research. However, there is often a disconnect between what the researchers are finding independently and what people who are trying to make money are taking into schools and profiting from, unfortunately, which is why this kind of transfer of knowledge between academics and teachers is so important, because teachers don't have time to go on a rabbit hole down a million different journal articles to find what they need. And unfortunately, the people that are going to schools are sometimes those people who are looking to profit as opposed to do what's best by the learners.
So we need to do better. We need to get more civic mission on the go. So just with that in mind, then, let's just, at the end of our civic mission bit, let's just draw that line really, really clearly for the listeners between learning styles in brackets, load of old rubbish. Pupils are not all exactly the same. And yes, we do have to, as teachers, not always necessarily teach things in the same way because pupils are different. Can you, with your amazing doctoral hat on, kind of just say that better than me?
Absolutely. Okay. So the kind of headline issue with learning styles, let's go there. So learning styles at its core is this idea that if we are pairing one specific modality of learning with the way that they're being taught, that this kind of congruence between preference and method is going to magically make learning better. Now, kind of appealing, yes, and comes out of, I think, some of the neuro research that shows that in the very early stages, when we process visual information, auditory information, whatever, it initially goes to a brain area that is just for that. So in the occipital lobe at the back here, that's where visual information starts off being processed in really basic ways. Where are the straight lines? Where are the corners? Really basic understanding of what's going on around us. However, very quickly, that information is integrated into a kind of more global perception of what our sensory systems are pulling into our minds. So when you recreate a memory of something that's happened to you, you don't only remember the image. Often it's paired with other things that you're hearing, maybe smells, and so on. It's an integrated picture of everything that's happening. And that firstly debunks learning styles because only very basic processing is happening in those initial kind of single modality brain areas. It's very basic processing. So immediately we know that learning styles, that's not how the mind works. It's not how the brain works. So actually, what research does tell us fairly rigorously is that the most effective way to help learners learn is through multimodal learning. So pairing auditory and visual information, pairing maybe like kinaesthetic activities with auditory information, however you want to do it in your classroom, whatever works for the information. As we've seen, some information is best presented a certain way. So that combination of different learning modalities helps to reduce cognitive load in learners. So it means that they're not relying on just listening. They can maybe listen, but at the same time hang it on a diagram that they can see in front of them and kind of integrate that together in a more meaningful way. Research looking at brain activity shows us that there is kind of more, that there is deeper processing of information when it's presented in a multimodal way. So I think by then having a variety of different avenues through which learners can access information, it does give some of that flexibility for preference, because at the end of the day, most of these learning style questionnaires, what they measure is preference. That doesn't necessarily have anything to do with skill. As we know, what learners prefer isn't necessarily what they're best at in lots of different ways. And by kind of giving learners access to all of the options, they can access things in a more flexible way, but we are not then pigeonholing them, removing opportunities from them to try and process things in a different way or to try new things. And I think one of the most important things is that learners should be encouraged to have a go at stuff. We want people who are keen to have a go, keen to try new things, open to new ideas. That's what we want from our learners. And so by giving them more opportunities to learn, more avenues to access information, and encouraging them to try to not be closed-minded about specific avenues of accessing information is, I think, the best that we can do for them, basically.
Well, I have a warm glow of civic mission about me now. I hope you do as well. Regular listeners will know that Louise is the only podcast guest that we have in our 8 years? Is it 8 years we've done now? Yes.
Oh my gosh.
Where we have to have a gimmick that puts you on the spot. You are the only one we do this for, Louise. I hope you're feeling loved.
Special and or bullied.
Well, yes, some of them have been a little bit mean. And since it's our last episode of the year, we really can't sort of let this go. I mean, I did do the Daisy Christodoulou thing on you, which you probably thought was your gimmick, but no, I've got something else for you. If you've not been listening since the start, you may not know that about 5 years ago, Louise made her first appearance on the podcast.
Was it 5 years?
It was about 5 years ago. We were in the midst of COVID lockdown. So you were at home, I was in my house, Emma was in her house. You were talking to us about psychology and education and I think having your first pop at a bunch of neuromyths. Yes. And then a scrap van came past. We always have this when we're recording, weird noises going on while people are recording. I actually went into the files yesterday and pulled out the clip of the original unedited recording of when this happened. So for anyone who hasn't heard it, this is Louise's first moment of glory on the podcast.
And the really great thing about this program is that it covers all of these areas within an educational context. Everything that you learn about psychology would be applied in education. I don't know if you guys can hear this. Sorry, there's like a van that drives around and it does a loudspeaker thing, and I'm sure you can.
Should we just pause for a moment? Yeah, we are picking a little bit of that. You can do the master's plug again once it's gone, or you've thrown a petrol bomb in its direction.
Oh my gosh, it's the most inconvenient timing. I didn't even know what they're saying. I think they're looking for steel, but I've never been able to understand a single word that they've said.
They're saying, bring out your neuromyths, bring out your neuromyths. Any old neuromyths?
Oh gosh, I thought it was going away, but it's getting louder.
They're getting closer.
So there we go. Much fun was had by all, Louise, and we christened the Neuromyth van. Does it still drive around your house, by the way?
Yeah, it was here this morning.
If only we recorded this morning.
We were about an hour too late recording to have had another cameo, unfortunately.
Well, for this final episode of the year, and with more civic mission in mind, we've decided to create Louise's Neuromyth van, in which you are allowed to place 3 of your scrap neuromyths to be taken away and crushed into cubes. So here is Louise's Neuromyth van.
Oh, complete with sound effects.
Complete with sound effect. What would you like to place in the van to be crushed into cubes and dropped in a sarcophagus a mile underground?
Okay, the first one, I think, the idea that if you don't drink enough water, your brain shrinks. I still hear this sometimes, or see it on TikTok is a wonderful and horrifying place, and sometimes I do see quite a lot of health related TikTok content, and do occasionally see that around. So yeah, your brain does not shrink if you don't drink enough water. It remains the same size. You might get a headache. But actually, as we have no nerve endings inside our brain is the only part of our body we can't feel. Your headache is not your brain shrinking. If you're dehydrated, do drink water, but don't start panicking that your brain's going to shrink. That's not how that works.
Okay, that one's been crushed.
Cool. Second one, that women are great multitaskers and men are not. This is not true. Sometimes I feel it is an excuse to, oh, you're a woman, you can multitask. Here's lots of things for you to do.
That's why you teach on 2 programs.
Yeah, that's why Louise, I teach on 2 programs. I'm just wonderful at multitasking. The reality is that everyone is terrible at multitasking. What you end up doing is 2 tasks not very well, rather than 1 task very well. Multitasking is not, it's not really a thing that anyone can do effectively. As I said, you might be able to do 2 things at once, but you're not going to be as effective at them as you would have been.
As I understand it, you're just switching very fast between concentrating on one at a time. Is that right?
Yes, yeah. You're not fully kind of doing 2 tasks at once.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that luckily we're crushing these one at a time in that case. There goes the second one. All right. Yeah, and finally, old dogs can't learn new tricks. I think maybe because I've aged significantly since my last podcast. Maybe this is why this came to mind. I don't know.
there is this kind of pervasive idea that as we get older, we are set in our ways, that we aren't necessarily going to learn new things, new skills, etc. That is not true. The mechanisms, there are some, issues around cognitive changes as we age, absolutely. And unfortunately for people like me who don't love healthy eating and doing exercise, one of the most effective ways to help protect our brains is to eat healthily and do exercise.
Do
I'm
as
sorry
I say,
to say.
not as I do, is it?
Yeah. But the mechanisms through which we learn new things, those mechanisms exist throughout our lifespan. They don't just switch off at a certain age. The kind of mechanisms through which we learn are happening at the level of like individual neurons, changing their structures, changing how they communicate with other neurons. Those processes persist throughout our lifespan. So there is no reason that we can't learn new things as we age, and that we can't try new stuff and learn from our mistakes, like believing neuromyths. We can change those things.
And I feel like that's another excuse that you've just blown out of the sky along with the multitasking one, isn't it? It's convenient, but untrue. Okay.
Convenient but untrue. Yes.
In that case, we will wave goodbye to the Neuromyth van. There it goes, off into the distance, to drop those 3 neuromyths down into a sort of huge pit beneath the earth to be encased in concrete and never be seen again. Your brain does not shrink if you don't drink enough water. You cannot multitask, whether you're a man or a woman. And old dogs and podcast dogs can learn new tricks. All right. Yes. Well, unfortunately, you're not let off something interesting, something to try, although you are allowed to give us one combined something interesting and something to try. How's that for a
awesome. That
little
sounds
bone
good.
I've thrown you there?
Cool. Let's go with creative writing for mental health. It's come up a lot in social conversations for me recently, and that kind of inspired me. Creative writing can be fun, regardless of your skill level. I think lots of people find it more fun than they realise that they're going to. I have a week in one of my modules on a criminology program that talks about how great creative writing can be for mental health and as a kind of tool after trauma, and just generally to kind of make us feel better. And I feel like even if you're not thinking of doing it for some sort of commercial reason, as obviously lots of people do look to sell their novels or poetry or whatever it is that they're doing, even if you're just keeping it to yourself, still being creative in that way can be a nice outlet. Also, unlike a lot of hobbies, it's much cheaper, I would say, than other hobbies out there. I say that as a person that has started many hobbies over the years and bought many bits of equipment that are now gathering dust.
You how the piano's going?
Oh gosh, it's not going great. I haven't done it for a little while. I found other hobbies. They've changed to a different hobby. So yeah, as a person that has spent lots of money on lots of different hobbies that kind of help keep me sane, creative writing is much cheaper, accessible to lots of people, and doesn't have to be something that you have to be amazingly skilled at to make a start having a go at, and does fairly consistently show nice impacts on well-being, mental health, stress levels, etc. So yeah, I would recommend as a thing to have a go at. If you find yourself thinking, oh, I'm going to do a bit of doom scrolling, or watch TV and not really take any of it in, maybe pick up a pen and paper instead and have a little go.
I feel like this is important to you because it sounds from your debunking bits of this episode, it sounds like you do spend a lot of your time seeing neuromyths all around you, and that it makes you sad, angry, disappointed?
Both. And my family still are aware that these are things that are upset me, and do still, I think I said on a previous podcast, bully me by saying things like, oh, that was very right-brained of me, wasn't it, Louise? To which I respond with swear words, usually.
Or a long piece of creative writing.
Yeah.
Well, there we go. Dr. Louise Allen-Walker, it has been, as ever, very interesting and a load of fun as well. hopefully we've done a little bit of good in the world by busting
Fingers
that neuromyth.
crossed.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it has been really interesting to do that. That is the end of the podcast for this season, for this year. We've hit our 21 episodes, plus all the political specials, which sadly didn't count. So we will be back with you a little bit over the summer, but mainly back in September, where we will be embarking on our 9th season. And hopefully, yeah, I know, we have sticking power. We stuck with our hobby.
Well done.
Thank you. And we will hopefully have you back on as well to do a bit more good in the community. How's that?
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay, well, thank you for listening this year and for this episode. Thanks to Louise for joining us down the line, and we will be back in your ears very soon. Bye for now. You've been listening to Emma and Tom Talk Teaching, a podcast about all things education, presented by me, Tom Breeze. The special guest this episode was Dr Louise Allen-Walker, and thanks to Louise for joining us to bust those neuromyths. Hope that feels better, Louise. Podcast artwork is by Beth Blandford, and the music is by Cameron Stewart. Technical support from Peter Lamburn, and the studio manager is Adrian Rapps. We'll be back soon with Season 9. Thanks for listening to Season 8. Take care and enjoy teaching.